I want them wherever they're at. Like, I have no inclination to where they're at right now. Like, I've exhausted like every friend that I know of, and every friend that I have has called friends that Shanann has that maybe I didn't know about, and it's just like it's vanished. Like, she's not, like, when I got home yesterday, it was like a ghost town. Like, she wasn't here, kids weren't here. I have no idea like where they went, and it's just earth-shattering. I don't feel like this is even real right now. It's like a nightmare that I just can't wake up from.
In August 2018, a quiet neighborhood in Frederick, Colorado, became the center of a story that would captivate the world. Shanann Watts and her 2 young daughters, Bella and Celeste, were reported missing. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, just silence. Within days, the man who reported them gone, the husband, the father, would confess to the unthinkable. Chris Watts had taken the lives of his entire family and buried them where no one was meant to find them. This is the story of what happened, why it happened, and the questions that still don't have answers. Welcome to the Chris Watts case. Chris Watts was, at first glance, the kind of man people often described with very safe words: quiet, polite, helpful, non-confrontational. A father who appeared gentle with his daughters, a husband who smiled in family videos, a man who worked in oil and gas, kept to a routine, and did not seem to make a scene. His wife, Shanann, was different in energy: bright, vocal, social, organized, present. She used social media the way many people use a diary, a scrapbook, and a public stage all at once. Her life was documented in fragments: family moments, health struggles, business posts, pregnancy announcements, videos of her children, and messages full of determination. She was a woman who had remade herself more than once, and she seemed to believe deeply in forward movement. Their daughters were Bella and Celeste, known as Cece. Bella was 4, more reserved, watchful, thoughtful. Cece was 3, more chaotic, lively, physical, the kind of little girl who could turn an ordinary room into a racetrack. Shanann was also pregnant. The baby had a name already: Nico. From the outside, the Watts family looked like a picture people recognized. A young couple, 2 little girls, a baby on the way, a house in the suburbs, a father leaving early for work, a mother building a life online. Nothing about that picture warned the world what was coming. But true stories rarely crack open all at once. They begin with a missed appointment. On the morning of Monday, August 13th, 2018, Shanann Watts did not answer her phone. At first, that may not sound alarming. People miss calls, phones die, pregnant women get tired, travel throws off sleep. Shanann had returned home very late from a business trip to Arizona. A friend had dropped her at home in the early hours of the morning. She was 15 weeks pregnant and reportedly not feeling well. A slow morning would not have seemed impossible, but the person trying to reach her knew her better than that. Nicole Atkinson, Shanann's friend, had been with her. She knew Shanann had a doctor's appointment that morning. She knew Shanann was not the type to vanish without explanation. She knew how attached Shanann was to her phone, and with each unanswered call and message, the ordinary possibilities began to shrink. Nicole did what good friends do when something feels wrong. She went to the house. Shanann's car was in the garage. Her children's car seats were still there. That mattered. Because if Shanann had gone somewhere with Bella and Cece, the car seats would likely have gone too. Her personal items were still inside. There was no obvious sign that a mother had packed up and left for a spontaneous day away. The front door could not be fully opened because of a latch. Windows and doors were checked. The house did not give up an easy answer. It simply sat there, locked and quiet, with all the signs of a family present, but no family to be found. Chris Watts was contacted. He was at work. He came home. When he arrived, the garage door opened, the house became accessible, and the search moved from worry to dread. Police and family friends entered a space that should have been full of noise. The noise was gone. No Shanann, no Bella, no Cece. The house was not ransacked. It did not immediately look like the aftermath of an obvious, violent invasion. There was no broken glass, no overturned furniture, no dramatic sign pointing to a stranger. Instead, it gave investigators something far more unsettling: small contradictions. Shanann's purse was still there. Her phone was eventually found in the home. Medication was there. The children's things were there. Her vehicle was there. Everything that should have traveled with a mother and 2 children seemed to be waiting in the house. But the mother and children were gone. At this stage, the narrator in this story does not know the truth. Nobody outside a very small circle knows it. The official shape of the case is still soft. It can still become many things. Maybe Shanann left in distress. Maybe she went with someone. Maybe there had been a medical emergency. Maybe there had been a marital argument and she wanted space. Maybe someone took her. Maybe the truth was sitting just outside the frame, waiting for everyone to turn their heads. Chris offered a version of the morning. He said Shanann had returned home around 2 in the morning. He said he had woken early, around 5, and they had talked. According to his account, the conversation was emotional but civil. He said they discussed separation. He said she told him she was going to take the girls to a friend's house. He left for work around 5:27 a.m. That time mattered because a neighbor's surveillance camera captured his work truck backing into the driveway in the early morning. It was the sort of detail that, on any other day, would have meant nothing. A man loading tools, a truck reversing, a garage, a workday beginning before sunrise. But now every frame had weight. When investigators and neighbors watched the footage, the focus was not only on what it showed, it was on what it did not show. There was no clear footage of Shanann leaving with the girls. No one saw her walk out. No one saw the children leave. No car seats were gone. No obvious friend appeared to collect them. And Chris, standing in the neighbor's home, watching the video, became part of the video in another way. People later focused on his body language, his posture, his stillness, the way he appeared to watch the screen. But body language is a dangerous thing to build certainty on. Some innocent people act strangely under stress. Some guilty people perform grief well. At this point, there was still room for doubt. A missing persons case had begun. And then Chris went on television. It is one of the strangest things in true crime, the public plea. A person stands in front of cameras and asks for someone to come home. Sometimes it is raw and real. Sometimes it is awkward because grief has no script. Sometimes the person speaking is innocent and traumatized. Sometimes, only later, does the world realize the plea was not a plea at all. It was theater. But on that day, to many viewers, Chris looked like a worried husband and father. He spoke about wanting his family back. He mentioned the emptiness of the house. He said he wanted them to return. He spoke in a way that seemed strangely flat to some and merely exhausted to others. He did not scream. He did not collapse. He did not appear frantic in the way people expected him to appear. But expectation can mislead. There is no single correct way to look when your pregnant wife and children are missing. Shock can make people robotic. Fear can make people quiet. Cameras can make ordinary people stiff. Viewers watching from their living rooms often believe they can recognize truth in a face. They usually cannot. So the story continued as a mystery. A pregnant woman and 2 little girls were gone. Their home held too many of their things. Their father said he had left for work. Their friend knew something was wrong before anyone else did, and the clock was moving. The first act of this story is not blood. It is absence. Absence is powerful because the mind rushes to fill it. It invents explanations. It searches for the least horrifying possibility. The brain does not want to believe that a family can vanish from a quiet house in the early morning, and that the answer might be sitting inside the house itself. The community searched. Law enforcement moved quickly. The case drew attention. Local news picked it up. Social media spread the faces of Shanann, Bella, and Cece. People saw a smiling pregnant mother, 2 little girls, and a husband asking for their safe return. But behind the public concern, investigators began doing what investigators do. They checked timelines. They compared statements. They looked at phones. They looked at movements. They looked at the house. They looked at the truck. They looked at the marriage. And the marriage, like many marriages, was not what it looked like in photographs. Shanann had spent part of the summer in North Carolina with the children, visiting family. Chris remained in Colorado. During that period, distance grew in a way Shanann could feel, even if she could not yet fully explain it. Messages between husband and wife reportedly reflected strain, confusion, and attempts to repair something that was slipping. To the outside world, the Watts family was still a family. Inside the marriage, something had changed. Chris had started a relationship with a co-worker, Nicole Kessinger. This detail would later become one of the most discussed parts of the case, but it needs to be handled carefully. She cooperated with investigators, and she was not charged in connection with the murders. The point is not to turn her into a villain in someone else's crime. The point is that the affair exposed a second life Chris was trying to keep separate from the first. In one life, he was a husband and father, with a pregnant wife and 2 daughters. In another, he was presenting himself as a man moving towards separation, a man with fewer ties, a man available for a new future. The problem with double lives is not only that they require lying, it is that they create pressure. Every message, every phone call, every family obligation, every pregnancy update, every debt, every expectation becomes a reminder that the fantasy life and the real life cannot both continue forever. Still, pressure is not motive by itself. Plenty of people have affairs, plenty of marriages break, plenty of people are overwhelmed by money, conflict, resentment, or shame. They do not kill their families. That is what makes this case so disturbing. The facts do not lead us toward a monster who was obvious from the beginning. They lead us toward a man who looked ordinary enough to be underestimated by almost everyone. The investigation tightened. Chris initially denied the affair. Then evidence showed he had not been honest. That matters in a missing persons case. A lie does not prove murder, but it changes the temperature in the room. It tells investigators that the person speaking is curating reality. And once someone is curating reality, the next question is simple. What else are they hiding? Police interviews are not only about questions. They are about pressure, rhythm, silence, and contradiction. Investigators let a person talk. They allow a story to build. They watch where it strains. They return to details. They offer possibilities. They observe whether the person rejects a false path or accepts it. Chris's story began to fracture. He agreed to a polygraph examination. Polygraphs are not magic truth machines, but in an interrogation setting, they can become psychological tools. The result, and the way it was presented to him, intensified the pressure. Investigators confronted him. The missing family story could no longer remain a missing family story. At some point, a terrible possibility was placed in front of Chris. What if Shanann had harmed the children? What if he had then reacted? What if the story was not premeditated evil, but rage, shock, a husband walking into something unbearable? That suggestion mattered, because Chris took it. He told a version in which Shanann was responsible for the girls' deaths, and he, in a rage, killed Shanann. It was a grotesque story, but it gave him something his silence did not. It gave him a way to admit part of the crime, while shifting the darkest part onto a dead woman who could not answer back. At this point in the episode, remember the structure. Our narrator still does not know the full truth. The audience is being taken through the case as it unfolded, and this version, as awful as it is, briefly becomes the shape of the public confession. According to that early account, Chris said he told Shanann he wanted a separation. He claimed he saw, or believed he saw, something involving the children. He claimed he reacted violently. He admitted that he loaded the bodies into his truck. He told investigators where they could be found. The search moved to an oil work site known as Survey 319. This is where the story stops feeling like a disappearance and becomes something else entirely. Investigators found Shanann in a shallow grave near oil tanks. Bella and Celeste were found in separate oil tanks. The place was connected to Chris's work. It was not random. It was not a stranger's hiding place. It was a site he knew. The ordinary father on television had led them there. The public learned pieces. The horror expanded. The language changed from missing to murdered. The faces on the flyers became memorial photographs. The question was no longer, where are they? It was, how could this happen? And who was Chris Watts really? But even now, the story had not fully turned, because the version Chris first gave investigators was not the truth. It was a half confession wrapped around a lie. And that is where this case becomes more than a murder story. It becomes a study in performance. There was the performance of the husband on camera. There was the performance of the concerned father opening the home to police. There was the performance of the man whose wife had supposedly left with the children. Then there was the performance of the man who claimed he killed only after witnessing an unforgivable act. Each version placed Chris near the center of the tragedy, but not fully responsible for all of it. Each version tried to preserve one last scrap of identity. Not a good husband, perhaps, not an innocent man, but not the kind of father who could do the thing the evidence would eventually show. That is the final mask in this case. Not innocence, less guilt. If he could not be innocent, he would try to be less guilty. For Shanann's family, the lie was another violence. Their daughter was dead, their grandchildren were dead, their unborn grandson was dead. And on top of that, Shanann was being accused by the man who had already deceived everyone around her. The cruelty of that is difficult to overstate. In many family annihilation cases, the killer does not only end lives. He tries to control the story afterward. He decides who the victims get to be. He decides how outsiders understand the marriage. He decides which private conflicts become public and which lies become explanations. It is not enough to kill the person. The person must also be rewritten. For a while, Chris tried to rewrite Shanann, but the evidence, the plea, and later interviews would pull that version apart. Before we reach the final reveal, we have to slow down and look at the life that was erased. To understand why the case moved so quickly from concern to suspicion, imagine the morning not as a headline, but as a sequence of rooms. The kitchen still knew the family. The stairs still knew the sound of children. The bedroom still held the evidence of sleep. The garage still held the car that should have been gone if Shanann had packed up the girls. None of it behaved like a voluntary disappearance. A voluntary disappearance usually leaves motion behind. A bag, a car missing, a message, a purchase, a call, a vague trail, even if the person leaving is upset. Here, the trail seemed to end inside the house, then restart with Chris's truck. That is the kind of contradiction investigators are trained to feel before they can fully prove it. They cannot arrest a feeling. They cannot charge a contradiction, but they can follow it. The first thing they had to separate was public emotion from evidence. Everyone wanted Shanann and the girls found alive. That hope can distort a case. People imagine a runaway mother, an impulsive decision, a friend who picked her up, a hospital visit, a phone turned off, a misunderstanding. Hope is generous. Evidence is not. The evidence was not generous to Chris's story. If Shanann had left, why was her car still there? If she had taken the girls, why were the car seats still there? If she had gone somewhere privately, why was her phone in the house? If she had planned to disappear, why miss a pregnancy appointment that morning without telling the friend who had just dropped her home? If she had gone to a friend's place, why did Chris not know which friend? None of those questions alone solved the case. Together, they formed a wall. Chris was now facing not just police, but the math of his own timeline. His version required Shanann to behave in ways that did not match her habits, her pregnancy, her relationships, or the objects she left behind. His version required Bella and Cece to vanish without the items that made it possible for them to travel safely. His version required the house to be both ordinary and inexplicable. That is why good investigators often listen less for the dramatic lie and more for the practical one. A person can invent emotion. They can invent a fight. They can invent a vague destination. But they often forget the car seats. They forget the phone. They forget the doctor's appointment. They forget that real life has logistics. And real life was closing in. There was another pressure too, Shanann's digital life. She had left behind a visible record of herself. Videos, posts, messages, photographs, memories, and fragments of marriage. Some people later treated that record unfairly, as if a woman's public confidence could be used to explain violence against her. But in the investigation, her digital life also created a baseline. It showed how present she was. It showed how often she communicated. It showed that sudden silence was not normal. Silence, in this case, was not personality. It was evidence. As the hours passed, Chris had to keep performing. That is harder than it sounds. A lie told once can sound clean. A lie repeated under stress begins to fray. Every person asking a question becomes a new audience. The police, Nicole, the neighbors, reporters, family, the girlfriend, his own father. Each audience needs a version that fits what they know. The problem for Chris was that those audiences were not isolated. Investigators could compare them. What did he tell Nicole? What did he tell officers? What did he tell reporters? What did he tell Nicole Kessinger? What did he tell his father? What did the camera show? What did the house show? The truth does not have to remember itself. A lie does. By the second day, the case had the terrible feeling of something moving toward a confession. Not because the public had all the answers, but because the circle around Chris was getting smaller. He had been the last known adult with Shanann. He had a changing marriage. He had concealed an affair. His work site was part of his mourning. His truck was on video. His explanation did not fit the physical world. The story he had presented was losing oxygen. Then came the interrogation room, where the performance had to survive without cameras, without neighbors, without the ability to retreat into vague concern. In that room, investigators did not need to call him a monster. They needed him to keep talking. There is a strange skill in interrogation, offering a person a smaller version of guilt, not because investigators believe it necessarily, but because the first confession often comes through a door the suspect can emotionally enter. A guilty person may not be ready to say, "I did everything," but he may be willing to say, "I reacted." He may not be ready to say, "I chose," but he may be willing to say, "I snapped." He may not be ready to say, "I murdered my children," but he may be willing to say, "Their mother did something and I lost control." That was the doorway Chris walked through, and once he walked through it, he could not walk back to innocence. The first confession was horrifying, but it was also strategic. It shifted the unbearable accusation away from himself and onto Shanann. It placed him in the role of a man who had done a terrible thing after supposedly seeing something worse. It was still murder, but it was murder with a story attached. A story in which he could imagine himself reacting rather than initiating. For a brief moment, that false version did what he needed it to do. It moved him away from total responsibility. But false stories have a cost. This one asked the world to believe that Shanann, a pregnant mother with a doctor's appointment that morning, had killed her daughters immediately after a marital conversation, and that Chris then killed her, but still went to work, gave interviews, and acted as if everyone was missing. It was not impossible, because terrible things are never impossible. It was impossible because it depended entirely on the word of the man whose story had already failed. The investigators did not have to accept it as truth to use it as movement. The locations he gave them mattered. The bodies were found where he said they would be. The case crossed the line from suspicion to devastation. Whatever remained uncertain, Chris had knowledge only the responsible person could have. That is the moment the public story inverted. The missing husband became the accused killer. The home became the crime scene. The work site became the disposal site. The worried interview became evidence of deception. Still, the worst version of the truth was not yet public. Not fully. The legal process moved with unusual speed because there was no trial in the traditional sense. No long courtroom battle over guilt. No weeks of testimony. No jury asked to choose between competing narratives. Chris pleaded guilty. For some people, that felt like relief. A trial would have forced Shanann's family to sit through details, photographs, arguments, and possibly more attacks on their daughter's character. For others, the plea meant that many questions would never be tested in open court. That is one reason the case still generates obsession. A guilty plea gives an ending, but it can deny the public the structure of a trial. It leaves people searching through discovery, interviews, documentaries, body camera footage, text messages, and behavioral analysis, trying to build the trial that never happened. But a public obsession can become dangerous when it forgets the victims. The Watts case attracted not only sympathy, but speculation. Strangers argued about Shanann's personality, the marriage finances, the affair, the girlfriend, the families, the smallest gestures in police video. Some of that attention came from a sincere need to understand. Some of it became cruelty dressed as analysis. That is why this story has to be told carefully. We are not here to put Shanann on trial. We are not here to turn Bella and Cece into plot devices. We are not here to make Chris larger than the lives he ended. We are here because this case shows how an ordinary image can conceal catastrophic danger, and how quickly a lie can collapse when the physical world refuses to support it. The final answer did not arrive as a dramatic courtroom confession. It came later, in a prison interview, after the sentence had already been imposed. By then, Chris had nothing legal to gain by protecting the first story. He had already admitted guilt in court, but psychologically, he still had versions of himself to manage. In that later interview, investigators went back through the morning. They asked about the house, the drive, the girls, the site, the earlier claim about Shanann, and piece by piece, the story became darker, not lighter. The lie that Shanann killed the girls was not merely corrected. It was exposed as something he had adopted when it was suggested to him. Think about the cruelty of that. He had already taken her life. Then he used her silence as a shield. He allowed suspicion to touch her name, because it made him slightly less monstrous in the first version of the story. That is not panic. That is preservation. And when self-preservation remains active after the deaths of your wife and children, it tells us something chilling about where the emotional center of the crime really was. Chris was not protecting Bella. He was not protecting Cece. He was not protecting Shanann. He was protecting the last possible image of himself. Shanann was not just a pregnant wife in a headline. She was a daughter, a friend, a mother, a woman with habits, flaws, routines, plans, and a future. She had gone to Arizona for work. She came home tired in the early hours. She had a doctor's appointment waiting. She had people who knew her patterns well enough to know silence was not normal. That is one of the most important details in the entire case. Nicole Atkinson did not save Shanann, because by the time Nicole knew something was wrong, it was already too late. But Nicole's insistence broke the timeline open. Without her concern, without her going to the house, without her pushing past the easy explanations, Chris may have had more time. More time to delete, move, explain, dispose, rehearse, and build the next version. Sometimes a case turns because of forensic science. Sometimes it turns because of surveillance. Sometimes it turns because someone loves the victim enough to be inconvenient. Nicole was inconvenient. She did not accept silence. She did not accept vague reassurances. She did not let the day drift. And because of that, the clock Chris thought he controlled began working against him. The neighbor's camera mattered too. It did not show the whole crime. It did not need to. It created a boundary around the morning. It showed Chris's truck. It raised questions about what was loaded, when, and why. It made the driveway part of the evidence. The house mattered. The purse, the phone, the car seats, the medication, the vehicle. They were ordinary objects, but in context, they became witnesses. A mother does not easily vanish without the items that make movement possible. Children do not usually disappear without car seats. Phones do not usually get abandoned by women who rely on them to work, parent, and communicate. The story Chris told required everyone to believe in a vanishing that left too much behind. That is often the weakness of a lie told in panic. It can explain one thing. It cannot explain everything. As the investigation continued, the emotional center of the case shifted from uncertainty to betrayal. People who had watched Chris on television replayed the interview. They looked at his words differently. They noticed the absence of tears. They noticed how he spoke about the house. They noticed how little urgency seemed to come through. But again, it is important not to pretend the public solved the case through instinct. Investigators solved it through work. Timelines, interviews, evidence, contradictions, phone data, surveillance, and the pressure of a story that did not hold. The public saw the mask fall after law enforcement had already loosened it. On November 6, 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to all 9 counts against him. The charges included multiple counts of first-degree murder, unlawful termination of pregnancy, and tampering with deceased human bodies. The death penalty was removed from consideration as part of the plea agreement, with the agreement of the victim's family. On November 19, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional years. The courtroom became the place where the private horror of that house was translated into law. But sentencing does not equal understanding. A judge can impose punishment, a prosecutor can describe the crime, a plea can establish guilt. But the question remains, echoing long after the file is closed. Why? Why would a man kill his pregnant wife and daughters? Was it the affair? Was it debt? Was it resentment? Was it the fantasy of starting over? Was it the pressure of being seen as a good man, while wanting a life that required him to abandon the people who believed he was one? The answer is probably not one thing. Crimes like this are rarely created by a single argument. They are created by entitlement, avoidance, emotional detachment, shame, fantasy, and the belief that other people are obstacles rather than human beings. Chris did not appear to be a man who exploded through life. He appeared to be a man who avoided confrontation, said what people wanted to hear, and moved quietly around problems rather than through them. But avoidance can become dangerous when the avoided truth is enormous. He did not want to be married. He did not want to be seen as the man who abandoned his pregnant wife. He did not want the financial, social, and emotional consequences of divorce. He did not want the new girlfriend to see the full weight of his existing life. He wanted the future without the cost of choosing it honestly, and that is where family annihilation often reveals its ugliest logic. The killer treats family not as people, but as evidence of an old identity. A wife becomes proof of obligation. Children become proof of permanence. A pregnancy becomes proof that the old life is not ending cleanly. To a healthy person, those are responsibilities. To a person thinking with lethal entitlement, they become barriers. That does not make the crime understandable in a sympathetic way. It makes it legible. There is a difference. The Watts case became infamous not because homicide inside families is new, but because the contrast was so sharp. The home videos, the smiling photographs, the social media presence, the television plea, the speed of the collapse. It felt like watching the American family image curdle in real time. One day, there was a family. The next, there was a husband asking for them to come home. Then there was a confession. Then there were oil tanks. Then there was a dead woman's name being dragged into a lie. The twist, at first, seemed to be that Shanann had not left voluntarily. Then the twist seemed to be that Chris knew where they were. Then the twist seemed to be that he blamed Shanann for the children. But the final twist was still waiting. Months after the sentencing, investigators interviewed Chris again. This was not a trial. He had already pleaded guilty. He was already sentenced. The legal outcome was no longer in doubt. But investigators wanted clarity. They wanted to understand what had happened beyond the shifting stories. In that later interview, the version changed again. The accusation against Shanann collapsed. Chris said he had never thought of that story until it was introduced during interrogation. He indicated he had gone along with it. That admission matters because it removes the last false shelter he had built for himself. The truth was not that Shanann killed the girls. The truth was not that Chris walked into a scene and reacted. The truth was that the man asking the cameras for his family's return already knew they could not return. The truth was that the father standing in the neighbor's house watching surveillance already knew why there was no footage of Shanann leaving with the children. The truth was that the husband opening the door to police already knew the house was empty because he had made it empty. Here is the reveal. According to his later account to investigators, Chris killed Shanann inside their home. Bella woke and saw enough to know something was wrong. Chris moved Shanann's body to his truck. He put the girls in the truck as well. They were alive during the drive to the oil site. That is the part that changes the entire emotional architecture of the case. For months, many people had tried to imagine the crime inside the house. The later account moved the final horror into the truck, into the long road between home and Survey 319. Into a drive where the children were not yet gone, and their father still had time to stop. He had time at the house. He had time on the stairs. He had time in the driveway. He had time on the road. He had time at the site. He had time after removing Shanann. He had time before Cece. He had time before Bella. Every moment was a door he did not open. That is why the case is so difficult to sit with. It was not a single, uncontrollable second. It was a chain of choices, each one darker than the last, each one requiring him to continue. In his later account, the girls asked questions. They were confused. They were near their mother. They trusted the only adult left with them. And at the oil site, Chris killed them too. The details are not repeated here for shock. They do not need embellishment. The truth is already unbearable. He then placed Bella and Celeste in separate oil tanks and buried Shanann nearby. He returned to ordinary life with the knowledge of what he had done. He answered questions. He texted. He spoke to reporters. He let the world search for people he had already hidden. And this is the real twist of the Chris Watts case. The monster was not hiding in the dark outside the house. The monster was not an intruder. The monster was not a stranger on the road. The monster was the man standing in the driveway, wearing the face of the worried father. At the beginning of this episode, we had a missing family, a pregnant woman who did not answer her phone, a friend who would not let it go, a quiet husband, a locked house, a work truck, a neighbor's camera, a story about separation, a plea for them to come home. By the end, every one of those details means something else. The missed appointment becomes proof that Shanann did not walk away. The phone left behind becomes proof that the story was wrong. The car seats become silent evidence that the children did not leave the way their father suggested. The truck becomes the vehicle of the crime. The neighbor's camera becomes the first crack in the performance. The television interview becomes a document of deception. The confession becomes another lie. And the final account becomes a window into a kind of violence that is not loud until it is irreversible. There are people who ask why this case still holds public attention years later. Part of the answer is horror. Part of it is the digital archive Shanann left behind. Part of it is the apparent normality of the family. But the deeper reason is fear. The case terrifies people because it suggests that the most dangerous person in a home may not look dangerous. He may pack lunches. He may go to work. He may smile in photographs. He may know how to sound calm. He may be described as quiet, helpful, normal. And still, inside him, resentment may be growing in a locked room no one else can enter. That does not mean every quiet person is dangerous. It does not mean every struggling marriage is a warning sign of homicide. It means appearances are not safeguards. A family photograph is not proof of safety. A soft voice is not proof of kindness. A public persona is not proof of private character. Shanann's life has often been dissected by strangers, sometimes cruelly, sometimes as if her personality or marriage somehow explains her death. That is one of the ugliest afterlives of true crime. Victims become content. Their messages are parsed. Their choices are judged. Their flaws are magnified because people want to believe that if they can find the mistake, they can avoid the same fate. But Shanann did not cause her murder. Bella did not cause her murder. Cece did not cause her murder. Nico did not cause his death. The responsibility belongs to Chris Watts. All of it. No affair required murder. No debt required murder. No separation required murder. No argument required murder. No fantasy of a new life required burying the old one in the ground. That is the line the story must never blur. At sentencing, the law gave its answer. Life without parole. The case was closed in the legal sense. But in the human sense, the story remains open, because grief does not end where court records end. Families continue. Friends continue. The children who should have grown older remain frozen in photographs. Shanann remains pregnant forever in the public memory of the case. Nico remains a name attached to a future that never arrived. For listeners, the temptation is to focus on Chris because he is the puzzle. But the more respectful ending is to turn away from him. Remember the friend who noticed. Remember the mother who came home late from a work trip and should have woken up to another ordinary day. Remember Bella, careful and watchful. Remember Cece, wild and bright. Remember Nico, whose life was still being imagined. Remember that the real story is not the cleverness of a killer. It is the destruction of a family. And before the final credits roll, there is one more thing to hold on to. True crime often trains people to look for the dramatic warning sign, the threatening message, the broken door, the neighbor hearing screams, the police record that everyone ignored. Sometimes those signs exist. Sometimes they do not. Sometimes the warning is quieter. It is a woman whose communication pattern changes, a friend whose gut will not settle, a husband whose explanation floats above the practical details, a house that contains every sign of presence except the people themselves. The Watts case is not frightening because it teaches us that everyone is secretly capable of this. That would be too broad and too hopeless. It is frightening because it shows how image can be mistaken for character, how conflict can be hidden behind domestic routine, and how a person determined to avoid consequences can decide that other lives are less real than his own desired escape. That is why the ending should not be a fascination with Chris Watts. It should be a refusal to let his version of reality survive. Shanann did not vanish. Bella and Cece did not vanish. Nico did not simply become part of a case file. They were taken from the world by the person whose role was to protect them. And remember the first clue, a phone call that went unanswered, a friend who knew silence did not fit, a house that looked normal, a father who said he wanted them back. And behind all of it, the truth waiting quietly in the driveway. This has been False Fiction, unscripted truth with no rules. If this story stayed with you, follow the channel and watch the full archive. Because sometimes the most unbelievable stories are not fiction at all.